participants. Okay.
Of the temple, and then it was known as the Day of Thanksgiving, and finally at some point it becomes known as Hanukkah. Even in English today, we have 18 ways of spelling this word, which maybe reflects the very varied terminology that this holiday had. That's a joke. I don't think it does. But the point is that it's not called Hanukkah until the rabbinic period. So on the one hand, you have records that portray this conflict as military and as galvanizing a totally new holiday. But you also have a set of documents that suggest that there's no holiday at all that's new, that whatever happened in 164 BCE when the Hasmoneans regained control of the temple, purify it, and dedicate it, is actually a restoration of an older holiday. And that the real part of the story is not a war, but an affirmation of God's concern for the Jerusalem temple and its welfare. So we have these two strains. So I'm going to share with you. I really don't like sharing in general because then I can't see your faces and I can't sort of feed off of your energy through my screen, but we'll make do. And I think that you had access to this. It's a 9-page document, so don't be overwhelmed. I'm not going to put you to sleep by reading all these sources word for word. But I want to open up with a little bit of history. This history is very important because I want to make the suggestion that you can map out these two strains, the military story and the theological story, onto Judea versus the diaspora. Judean sources, especially 1 Maccabees, which we're going to look at, focus on the historical record, the clash, the military aspect of this rebellion. But as Judean writers take into account a diaspora and Jewish community, and they say we need to convince these people in the diaspora, these Jews living all over the Greco-Roman world, to take on observance of this holiday, they have to market it. And they're not going to market it like a war. We want a war, so you should celebrate. That's bad logic, right? If it's just a war, you celebrate it. I'm living in Alexandria in 150 BCE, or I'm living in eastern regions of the Greco-Roman Empire, or in Antioch or Rome or wherever. I don't need to celebrate your war. Judean writers have to market the holiday. And the way that they market it is they say, this was a miracle that reflects God's care for you. And so we're going to see that these two aspects, these two kinds of recording of the story, map onto the Judean experience versus the diasporan hearing of it secondhand. So to really understand why this all matters, we have to recognize something that I think many of my Catholic students kind of forget, which is in the late Second Temple period, the majority of Jews are not in Judea. The majority of Jews are all over the Greco-Roman world. You have at least a couple 100,000 Jews in Judea. You always have Jews in Judea. There's only one time in history of the Jews where Judea really has no Jews, and that's after the First Crusade in the 11th century. So of course there are conservative estimate, 300,000, probably more Jews in Judea, probably maybe even up to 1 million. But there's a robust community of Jews in Alexandria, maybe even up to also 1 million in Egypt. Like I said, Antioch, all over the Greco-Roman Empire. In fact, the Roman historian Strabo in the 1st century BCE says, wherever you go in the Roman Empire, you will find a synagogue. So even when this rebellion is occurring, Antiochus IV Epiphanes invades the temple in 175, 1 Maccabees tells us, on his way back from having a war with the Ptolemaic king in Egypt, already, this is not a story about all Jews. And you might hear contrasted to the story of Esther, right? Esther's tells a story of all the Jews, 127 provinces in the Persian. Maybe it's not every Jew on the planet, but it's all the Jews in the Persian Empire. So you're talking about, vast, vast population. Already, this is not that. This is a local conflict. So just to back up over here, what's going on in the early 2nd century BCE? We're well into the Hellenistic period. In fact, the Hellenistic age begins in 323 BCE, right? So that's 123 years before 200 BCE. When Alexander the Great dies in 323 BCE, he doesn't leave a will. His kingdom splits up into 3 parts. You have the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids to the north of Judea, and you have the Antiochids to the east, to Asia. And so you have 3 empires, and they're vying for territory. What is right in the middle? What is the prime real estate? That's right in the middle, connecting these 3 kingdoms. Tiny little Judea. Everybody wants it. It's a trade route. It connects the empires. It's desirable land. Most of the 3rd century BCE, so after Alexander the Great dies, for the following 120 years or so, most of that time, Judea is under the Ptolemaic, that is the Egyptian Hellenistic kingdom. Life is good. This is a very important detail because it tells you there isn't an imminent culture clash between the world of the Greeks and the world of the Jews. The Jews live under Hellenism, Ptolemaic Hellenism, but Hellenism for about 130 years before things go bad. So when the records tell you, and you'll see it in 2 Maccabees, when the records tell you this is a clash of cultures, be wary, because Jews did just fine under the Ptolemaic kingdom. Now you do have the Seleucids trying over and over and over to get Judea. And there are a series of wars called the 6 Syrian Wars. I have it over here. No, I actually didn't put it in, but you could sort of see where it would have happened in the 3rd century BCE, where the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are vying over Judea. And finally, in 200 BCE, Judea falls under Seleucid rule. And this is where the problems begin. Under Antiochus III the Great and his son Antiochus IV Epiphanes, there seems to be a program to get those stubborn Jews to stop clinging to their ancestral laws and to finally assimilate. And the big mystery among scholars is why this happens. Why is there a series of prohibitions regarding the observance of Jewish ancestral law beginning around 175 BCE? How does this happen? It seems out of the blue. We don't have complete records. We do have hints as to what happened. And I'm going to introduce to you the oldest and probably the most accurate account of the war. This is preserved in the Apocrypha, of course, in the Deuterocanonical books, 1 Maccabees. And this is really the only, what I would call eyewitness account we have to go on. It was written in Hebrew, preserved in Greek very early on, translated, but written in Hebrew in Judea, probably commissioned by somebody who worked for the Hasmonean dynasty. So it's very pro-Hasmonean, by which I mean there are many encomium, there are many Greek, Hellenistic passages about how wonderful and perfect and brave and amazing and pious the Hasmonean family is. So there is no objective history in the ancient world. There is no text of history in the Greco-Roman period that's, just utterly factual. Just one might argue the same thing for today. History can never be objective. And certainly there is polemical material in 1 Maccabees. At the same time, this is as objective as we're going to get. We have a story in the beginning of the book that the king has, I didn't include all of it here because it's already 9 pages, which I figured was enough for you. Antiochus IV Epiphanes is returning from war with Ptolemy, and he wants to invade Jerusalem, presumably to take money from the treasury to pay for this expensive war, although some suggest maybe it was because the Jews were loyal to Ptolemy. Remember, they were under the Ptolemaic rule for so long, so it could be he wanted to punish them. He felt vindictive. It's not clear what's going on. We don't have the full picture, but he invades the temple, and sometime after that, when the Jews just totally freak out about this, he says, you know what? And another thing, no more Sabbath, no more circumcision, no more dietary law on pain of death. Now, these are the 3 identifying markers of Jewish practice in the ancient world. The 3 things that would mark you as a Jew: dietary law, circumcision, Sabbath. Some have suggested to me in my classes, oh, purity laws. And I say no, not purity laws. Purity laws may be in parts of Judea, but I'm talking about every Jew wherever you lived in the Greco-Roman world. Those are the big 3. Maybe I would add the regular reading of the scriptures in synagogue as well. Why does Antiochus IV Epiphanes do this? Why is he so bent on forcing the Jews to integrate into the Hellenistic world? So I don't know that I can satisfactorily answer that. I can tell you what this text says. This text places as much blame on Jews as it does on Greeks. So if you take a look at page, well, actually go back to here. When he's talking about the prohibition to observe ancestral Jewish law, the writer says, many from Israel gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols, profaned the Sabbath. The king sent letters. He told them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid the burnt offerings on the Jerusalem temple, of course, to profane the Sabbath, etc., to leave their sons uncircumcised. Remember, I said these are the things you're going to see over and over. Dietary law, circumcision, Sabbath, over and over you're going to see that. And he says, anyone who doesn't listen and keeps these things will die. But look at how it's framed. Many of the people of Israel, everyone who forsook the law, but should have kept the law, they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding. Not the Greeks, the Jews. So now you have this little prohibition, a big prohibition from Antiochus IV Epiphanes, sandwiched in between blame. And who's receiving the blame? It's the Jews who are assimilating. When I highlight, do you see that? Can you nod?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes,
okay, that's
awesome.
No, thank you. Okay, so now we already have a subtext. The subtext is that the enemy might not just be Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The enemy might be those Jews who are embracing Hellenistic culture. It's not said explicitly. However, there's quite a shocking passage when Mattathias, in Hebrew Matityahu, and his 5 sons, including the famous Judah, assemble a ragtag army and they start to fight the Greeks. You're going to be a little shocked unless you've seen this passage before. They're running around the countryside forcibly circumcising uncircumcised boys, Jewish boys. They hunted down the arrogant. The work prospered in their hands. I mean, this is quite shocking. So they're not just on the lookout for the henchmen of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. They're fighting against other Jews. So now we have, again, hints of an intra-Jewish conflict. Could it be that Antiochus IV Epiphanes is coming into Judea because he knows that Jews are already fighting with each other about whether to integrate into the Hellenistic world? This is not a settled question among academics. And it's probably a chicken and egg thing, where you have both dynamics, right? You have a profound desire on the part of the Greeks to get those Jews to be good citizens, right? Stop adhering to your barbaric, superstitious laws. Get with the program. You want the benefits of being a Greek, you got to live like a Greek. And there's also this intra-Jewish conflict going on at the same time. At the end of the day, however, this text commemorates a war. There isn't an explicit theological message that is relevant to every Jew. So how is this war commemorated? On the 25th day of Kislev, which is coming up in 2 weeks. I don't know if I was invited tonight because Hanukkah is around the corner, but I become very popular this time of year. There are like 3 weeks a year where people are interested in what I have to say. So this is like the time of year where I'm talking about Hanukkah all the time. It's coming up on the Jewish calendar. On the 25th day of Kislev, so it's in December, they rose, they offered sacrifice as the law directs on the new burnt offering, because remember, Antiochus IV Epiphanes desecrates the temple. From 175 to 164 BC, they don't have access to the temple. Finally, they get access back. So they celebrate, they fall on their faces, they worship heaven, the God. They celebrate the dedication of the altar for 8 days. They give offerings. And there seems to be no allusion to any sort of holiday that existed before this. We're going to see in later documents that there's an effort to sort of match this rededication with older Jewish holidays, but not here. This is a new holiday It's a holiday specifically to commemorate and celebrate the Hasmoneans and their victory over the Syrian Greeks. This is the one and only account that is so clean in terms of why the holiday is made and what it commemorates. We're going to see in other sources an effort to suppress the military aspect of the holiday, and the question is why. So let's keep going. 2 Maccabees, one of my favorite works ever. I can't get enough of this book. It is absolutely delightful. This is a totally different account of the story. Many just assume 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, what's the difference? Could not be more different. This story derives from a diasporan Jew named Jason of Cyrene, whereas 1 Maccabees was written by an insider of the Hasmonean court in Hebrew with the purpose of writing an encomium, a praiseworthy but technically accurate account of the Hasmonean rebellion. That is of total unconcern to the writer of this book. The writer of this book, who's writing in gorgeous Greek, does not care a whit about the Hasmonean family. He wants to tell a diasporan audience that God cares about the welfare of the temple, Jerusalem, and the Holy Land of Judea. That's not a story about the Hasmoneans. It's a story about God's commitment to the temple and those who are loyal to the temple. The whole story is extremely Hellenized, with lots of pathos and soliloquy and drama, and every kind of Hellenistic trick is thrown into this book. Miracles, I mean, it's so elaborate and hyperbolic. But the greatest thing about this book is the irony of using Hellenistic stylistics to talk about how horrible Hellenism is. Because it's in this book that for the very first time in Jewish literature, we have the word Judaism. I can't emphasize how important that is, right? If you look at the Hebrew Bible, I have my Tanakh, my Hebrew Bible here somewhere under the rubble of my desk. There's no word for Judaism, right? Even the word Jew, Yehudi, it's very late. You see it in Esther, you see it in some other, like maybe Ezra Nehemiah, but it's very late in terms of where you find it in the Bible. Judaism, you have the Israelite religion, right? How do we get from the Israelites to the Jews? Well, 2 Maccabees gives us a lot of hints. And 2 Maccabees uses this word, Judaismos, for the very first time. Not only that, but it pits it against the word Hellenismos, Hellenism. And so this is the first record that interprets the Hasmonean conflict with the Syrian Greeks as an imminent, unavoidable culture clash. Whereas we know that the Judeans were living under Hellenism for 130 or even 150 years before the war happens. 2 Maccabees says, I don't care about that. You are talking about a clash of values, a clash of cultures. You cannot be Greek and Jewish. Now, of course, this is a construct. If somebody, I'm from Philadelphia, if somebody were to say, Malka, are you Jewish or are you American? I would laugh you out of the house. Like, what kind of question is that? What does that mean? I refuse to have to choose. I mean, probably I would say, if I have to choose, I'm Jewish, right? But it's a question that wouldn't make sense to me. And if you had asked someone in the ancient world, a Jew living in Alexandria, are you a Greek or are you a Jew? Probably they would have been offended, because these Jews who were loyal to their ancestral traditions also embraced many aspects of Hellenistic life. But 2 Maccabees uses the story to say, you can't. All you diasporan Jews, you can't enjoy the benefits of Hellenism and truly be loyal to your ancestral tradition. You must reject Hellenism. And how does he do it? In the most gorgeous Greek you could possibly imagine. So now we have a very, very highly educated individual throwing it back and saying, I don't want it. 2 Maccabees focuses on miracles and divine intercession. And so I want to read a little bit of this to you because it reads so differently from 1 Maccabees. It's so beautiful, but so dramatic. It's almost as if it was meant to be performed on a stage. We have a general named Heliodorus, who, like Antiochus Epiphanes in 1 Maccabees, tries to violate the temple by entering it and looting the treasury. And everybody starts freaking out. Heliodorus is coming. What are we going to do? How do we fight him? There was no little distress throughout the city. the priests prostrated themselves before the altar and called to heaven upon him who had given the law about deposits, that he should keep them safe for those who had deposited them. To see the appearance of the high priest. I love this verse. To see the appearance of the high priest was to be wounded at heart. Very Hellenist. You would not find a verse like this in 1 Maccabees. 1 Maccabees was like, and then they went here, and then they went there. His face and the change in his color disclosed the anguish of his soul, where terror and bodily trembling had come over the man, which plainly showed to those who looked at him the pain lodged in his heart. How Hellenist is this? And yet, this is a story that tells you cannot be Hellenist. There was something pitiable in the prostration of the whole populace and the anxiety of the high priest in his great anguish. Now, what ends up happening is that there's a miracle. The people are not saved because of their military strength, and that's very important. And 1 Maccabees is all about the military power of the Hasmonean family. No, here it's God. They could not have won without God. There was a miracle, and this is so great. 2 highly attractive angels show up and just start beating the heck out of this guy. He arrives at the treasury, Heliodorus, with his bodyguard, and then and there, the sovereign of spirits caused a manifestation that all who had been so bold as to accompany him were astounded by the power of God and faint with terror. There appeared to them a magnificently caparisoned horse, a frightening mien. Its rider was seen to have armor and weapons of gold. 2 young men appeared to him remarkably strong. These are angels, of course. Gloriously beautiful, splendidly dressed. They stand on either side of him and they just beat him up. Now, this is a miracle because these are not human men. Heliodorus is so freaked out and so scared he runs away. And this sets the stage for the entire book. This happens very early on in the story. Divine intercession is what saves us, the writer of 2 Maccabees tells his diaspora and Jewish audience. God will intercede wherever we experience a crisis. And so this success was not just the success of the Jews in Jerusalem, it was the success of every single Jew in the celebration and in the knowledge that God will intervene likewise for you should you need it. We have a very famous story at the very, very, very center of 2 Maccabees, and this story is extremely important for the Catholic tradition. This is the story of the mother of the 7 sons, and I'm going to get back to it later. But this story becomes extremely important for purposes of martyrdom because martyrdom becomes so central to the Christian experience in the 2nd through 4th centuries CE. So you could read about that on your own. I included it on the source sheet, but I'm not going to focus on it right now. I want to focus on the establishment of a holiday in 2 Maccabees and compare it with the establishment of the holiday in 1 Maccabees. Remember, in 1 Maccabees, there's a war, there's Jewish victory, let's make a celebration. It's very straightforward. We have something very strange in 2 Maccabees. Some added detail that almost seems unnecessary. Okay, they come back to the sanctuary. It's on the 25th day of Kislev, just like in 1 Maccabees. Very good. They celebrated for 8 days, just like in 1 Maccabees. Wonderful. In the manner of the Festival of Booths, that's new. The Festival of Booths, otherwise known as Tabernacles or Sukkot, is the harvest festival that usually takes place on the 15th of Tishrei. So the 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah, the new year, and usually 2 weeks afterwards, you have Sukkot. This is a biblical holiday. It's a pilgrimage holiday. It's mentioned in Leviticus 23. It's mentioned even in Nehemiah chapter 8. It's one of the 3 pilgrimage holidays: Passover, the Festival of Weeks, and the Festival of Booths. What is it doing here? Why do we have this? They celebrate in December the Festival of Booths, remembering how not long before, during the Festival of Booths, they'd been wandering the mountains and caves like wild animals. Now remember, the Festival of Booths commemorates the 40-year sort of sojourn of Israelites in the wilderness. And presumably in 164 BCE, they hadn't properly celebrated this festival because they didn't have access to the temple. And they said, well, we didn't celebrate this holiday properly 3 months ago. We were wandering in our own wilderness, hiding from the Greeks. Let's celebrate it now. And so according to 2 Maccabees, there's no Hanukkah, right? There's no Day of Purification. There's Sukkot in December. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches and fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving, who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. And this, I think, is very interesting, because you might read this and say, wow, so Hellenistic. I could think of all these Greek festivals to the gods where they would have these processionals going through the streets and ending at a temple with ivy and palm, and that is probably correct. But also, if you look at Nehemiah 8, when the people in the very early years of the restoration, when they're rebuilding the second temple, and they have this period, the post-exilic period of restoration, we're told that they celebrate Sukkot at the end of the chapter in Nehemiah 8, and they take palm leaves, and they take these leaves that are indigenous to the land of Israel, and they use them to build these huts. It's a very interesting passage, and I can talk about it more if you're curious in the Q&A session. I think that this verse is alluding to both. It's a Hellenistically resonant verse, but it's not outside of how you would have celebrated Sukkot in the ancient world. So anyway, we have these two very different accounts of what's going on the 25th day of Kislev. What is this holiday all about? What is the story about? How is this conflict interpreted by Jews in Judea and Jews in the diaspora? Again, in 1 Maccabees, we have this very straightforward, this is a new holiday, and this new holiday is commemorating a military conflict. 2 Maccabees, no. They were keeping Sukkot in December. And lots of miracles. This is a story of divine intervention, not necessarily a story of a military success. Or if that is a story, that's not the message of the story. Well, we also have late Second Temple descriptions of the holiday of Hanukkah that postdate these two texts. And I want to introduce you to my good friend Josephus. Now, Josephus, at least when I'm teaching Jews, gets a very bad rap. Nobody likes to hear about Josephus. I'm not sure why, but Josephus has a certain reputation as being not trustworthy. I'm curious to know whether you agree. Josephus was involved in the Jewish rebellion against Rome, the war that lasted from 66 to 73 CE, 7-year war. And he was taken captive in 69 CE by a general named Vespasian, who becomes emperor the next year. And because Josephus was so obsequious to Vespasian, and Josephus tells us, this may be legendary, but he tells us, I told Vespasian, you general will become emperor. Whatever he said, Vespasian likes Josephus. And when Vespasian becomes emperor, he releases Josephus from his bonds. Remember, I said Josephus was taken prisoner. He was a general in the army. He was taken prisoner, but released with great honors by Vespasian, who liked him very much. In 70 CE, Jerusalem is under siege. Vespasian takes Josephus to Jerusalem to act as a translator for his son, Titus. The Jews see now Josephus in Roman garb. What is this guy? He used to be a Jerusalemite who was fighting for us. Now, you clown, you're fighting for the enemy. The Jews must have regarded him as quite a traitor. And still this stereotype, it's not a stereotype, this negative attitude, which could certainly be legitimate, endures when it comes to Josephus. But Josephus ends up writing over and over and over these very systematically deliberate defenses of Judaism. So he doesn't assimilate. Josephus writes 4 works. He writes an Antiquities of the Jews, 20 volumes. And this is a history of the Jewish people beginning with Genesis. Massive work, his magnum opus. He writes an autobiography, which may or may not be reliable, depending on what scholar you're reading, called Vita, Life. He writes the first systematic defense of the Jewish religion ever to be produced against Apion. And he writes a 7-volume work, an account of the Jewish war from 66 to 73 CE. That's the Jewish war. But he doesn't start the Jewish war in 66. He backtracks, and he wants to give the reader lots of background as to how the Jews got themselves in the mess that they did in the first century. Josephus goes all the way back. He begins his 7-volume account of the Jewish war, again, that is in 66 CE, goes all the way back to the 2nd century BC. And I'll pause here and I'll say, I don't think Josephus says, he doesn't say this. Maybe he didn't think it. I think that when the Jews rebelled against Rome in 66, and their world came crashing down. The temple falls in 70 CE, and they're totally shell-shocked by this. I think that they were trying to effect a victory like the one that they had in 175 to 164. I think that that memory of Hanukkah was so powerful and enduring in their collective conscience that they tried to do it again and were shocked when it was a catastrophe. Anyway, looking at the Jewish war, this is what we find. He retells the story with a good amount of loyalty to 1 Maccabees. And I'm not going to go through all the details of the war because it is quite similar to 1 Maccabees. Here he has actually 2 Maccabees 6, the martyrdom of Eleazar, which shows up in Josephus. Did Josephus have 2 Maccabees, or did he have a source that had 2 Maccabees? Probably he wasn't reading 2 Maccabees word for word. Probably this was a very well-known story about the martyrdom of Eleazar. Now, it's in Antiquities where, remember, Antiquities is a 20-volume work that goes through all of Jewish history, where he doesn't spend that much time actually. He spends time in both the Jewish war and Antiquities talking about the military conflict, but it's in Antiquities where he has a very interesting detail about the holiday of Hanukkah. Why was this holiday celebrated? What did it mean for Jews? Judas. Sorry, I just had to find my place in my notes. Judas celebrated the festival, the restoration of the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days. Okay, so we have 8 days in all of these sources so far. He omitted no sorts of pleasure. He feasted them upon very rich and splendid sacrifices. He honored God. They were so very glad at the revival of their customs when, after a long time of intermission, they unexpectedly had regained the freedom of their worship, blah, 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 blah. Okay. From that time to this, we celebrate this festival and we call it lights. Now, there is no reference to this in 1 Maccabees or 2 Maccabees, but you might all know what a menorah is. Because if you go into Walgreens in December, you'll find Christmas decorations, and then you'll find menorahs, which is why many Christians and maybe some Jews think that Hanukkah is like a bigger deal than it is, like a major, major Jewish holiday. It's not, but you know, everybody knows what a menorah is. Festival of Lights, right? When in 164 BCE, the Jews came back to the temple and they had to rededicate the building. They couldn't find any oil. They only found a tiny little vial of olive oil, of pure olive oil, to use to light the menorah, but miraculously it lit for 8 days. That's the story that all Jewish kids learn when they're little. It's not in 1 Maccabees. It's not in 2 Maccabees. We're going to see that the earliest reference to that story is a 6th century rabbinic text. So why, in the 90 CE, when Josephus is writing this, why are they calling this the Festival of Lights? Now, what's so great is that Josephus has no idea. He's like, we call it the Festival of Lights, and he makes up this, pardon me, BS answer because he just doesn't have a good answer. I don't know. I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and that thence was the name given to that festival. Judas rebuilt the walls around the city. He fortified the city, blah, blah, blah. So maybe because we were allegorically living in darkness, and then Judas gave us new light. So he allegorizes it. That's not satisfactory because that could be applied to any Jewish holiday. We were in crisis, then we were saved. You could call any holiday, by that logic, the holiday of lights. He's missing something. He's missing something, and he knows it. So by the 1st century, Jews are all calling this the holiday of lights, and nobody really knows why, not even Josephus. So now we have a problem. We have 2 documents from the 2nd century BC that seem to conflict, right? We have a straightforward history about a military conflict, and then a holiday that commemorates it. We have a very Hellenized diasporan text about God's theological intercession, and it's commemorated with a sort of Sukkot, Tabernacles, Booths holiday in December. And then you have Josephus, who a couple centuries later is saying, well, this is the holiday of lights. Don't ask me what that means. I'm not really sure. So we seem to be entering into ever murkier waters. And with 23 minutes, I'm going to try to solve it. Now, the key to all of this might be 2 letters that are appended to the book of 2 Maccabees. So if you've read 2 Maccabees before, you know that it doesn't start in chapter 1, verse 1. It starts in chapter 2, verse 18. So if you open up to any NRSV, you know, I have my NRSV right here, whatever Bible version you use, you open up to 2 Maccabees, the very beginning of the book is not the beginning of the book. At some point in the 1st century BCE, a scribe who was circulating or copying the book of 2 Maccabees added 2 letters that he found to the book that he felt explained the nature of the story. And these are ancient letters written by Judean Jews to the Jewish community of Egypt, trying to convince them to observe this newly established holiday. These letters are fascinating because they're the real deal, right? To have letters from the late 2nd century BCE that explain how Jews are interpreting the meaning of the story and how they want diasporan Jews to think about it. This is going to be the link that helps us to understand how Hanukkah was understood. And again, you're going to see when Judeans are talking to diasporans, they're suppressing the military story and they're trying to search for theological meaning. And so in the first story, dated to around 124 BCE, we have this very, very little brief story, the Jews, a letter, the Jews in Jerusalem to their Jewish kindred in Egypt. May God do good to you, very typical to open up with a blessing. May he remember his covenant with Abraham. May he give you all a heart to worship and to do his will with a strong heart and willing spirit. I actually have a book on ancient Hellenistic letters somewhere on my desk. Very, very typical Hellenistic structure here. Open up with a wish. May he open your heart to his law and his commandments. May he bring peace. We are praying for you here. Now the letter embeds in it an older letter. The letter says, back in the reign of Demetrius, back in around 124 BCE. This actually, it's 169 is confusing because they're counting from 311 BCE from the beginning of the Seleucid era. So it's not 169, it's 311 minus 169. We wrote to you in critical distress that came upon us in those years after Jason and his company. Actually, sorry, I have to interrupt. This letter is written in 124 BC. This is 143 BC. We wrote to you in critical distress that came upon us in those years after Jason and his company revolted from the Holy Land. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but there were still conflicts, intra-Jewish conflicts, even after 164 BCE. And I could talk about that later if you're interested. But the point is that the letter writers in 124 say to their Egyptian Jewish kin, we wrote to you about what happened with the Hasmoneans, and that we prayed to the Lord and we were heard, that we offered sacrifice and grain offering, we lit the lamps, we set out the loaves. And now see that you keep the festival of booths in the month of Kislev. So now we're back to this, the festival of booths, right? Remember, this is how 2 Maccabees describes it. Very confusing. What's going on? So why aren't they talking about Hanukkah as its own holiday? Why are they talking about Hanukkah as simply another holiday that's transplanted into December? Let me show you the next letter. This is a very long letter, and I encourage you, if you have time, I'm just scrolling down because I want you to see how very long it is, unusually long for a letter of this kind. This letter is considered to be a forgery, by which I mean it's set in 164 BCE, but it was probably written at the end of the 2nd century BCE. How do I know it's set in 164 BCE? The people of Jerusalem and Judea and the Senate and Judas, Maccabees. So it seems that this letter is is attributing itself to the community of Hasmoneans in 164. This is a very complicated letter, so I'm just going to point out the main things that I want you to know from it. To Aristobulus, who is of the family of the anointed priests, teacher of King Ptolemy, to the Jews in Egypt, greetings and good health. This is a letter that tries to convince the Egyptian Jews to celebrate Hanukkah. It's not called Hanukkah yet. On the 25th of Kislev, we shall celebrate the purification of the temple. So we thought it was necessary to notify you in order that you may also celebrate the festival of booths and the festival of fire given when Nehemiah, who built the temple and the altar, offered sacrifices. I don't want to lose you by reading this line by line, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what this says, and then you should read it on your own if you can. The story that the speakers tell is a story that explains why Hanukkah became associated with light, why Hanukkah became associated with fire. In fact, I think that this is the text that tells us why we call Hanukkah the Festival of Lights. There is no reference here to finding a little jug of oil that miraculously lasts 8 days. But there's a story here about Nehemiah and Jeremiah. The story is that at the beginning of exile, when Jeremiah the prophet in 587, 586 was leading Judeans out of Judea and taking them to exile, he told temple priests to hide some fire from the temple. And they hid that fire. That fire miraculously remained ignited all during the exilic period. So that when Nehemiah, in the post-exilic period, whenever you might date Nehemiah, let's say the 515 BCE or early 5th century BCE, when Nehemiah comes back with 43,000 Judeans, he tells his priests, look for that fire that Jeremiah hid. They find this liquid, this viscous, weird stuff. They put it onto the altar and it miraculously ignites. And that's the story that this letter tells. What does this have to do with anything? We haven't seen anything about this story in 1 Maccabees or 2 Maccabees, or Josephus for that matter. When Nehemiah sees this miracle, he utters a prayer. O Lord, Lord, creator of things, you're awe-inspiring and strong. You alone are bountiful. You rescue Israel from every evil. Accept the sacrifice on behalf of all our people and preserve your portion and make it holy. Gather together our scattered people. Set free those who are slaves among the Gentiles. Hold on a second, I just need tissue. So this whole story goes on, right? There's this miraculous fire. Nehemiah is praying. It's all very miraculous. What is he praying for? He's praying for the ingathering of the exiles. Okay, that's his whole life's work, right? His whole goal in life, he fails actually, is to bring all the Judeans who are in exile back to Judea. He only brings 43,000 back. But I want to take you to the end of the letter over here. Since we are about to celebrate the purification, we write to you, will you please keep the days? It is God who has saved all his people and has returned the inheritance to all, and the kingship and the priesthood and the consecration, as he promised through the law. We have hope in God that he will soon have mercy on us and will gather us from everywhere under heaven into his holy place, for he has rescued us from great evils and has purified this place. This letter associates the celebration of Hanukkah not with the Hasmonean Conflict, but with a holiday that precedes it, a holiday about miraculously igniting light, a holiday about God's forever protecting the people and the temple that they are loyal to. So Hanukkah now is not rooted in 175 to 164 BCE. It's rooted in an older story, a story about the people's loyalty to the temple and about God who rewards that loyalty. This, by the way, is a letter that I would say 99.999% of Jews have no idea exists. But this is the link, I think. I want to take you 600 years ahead into the future because we don't have so much time. Although, page 8, not bad. How do the rabbis tell the story of Hanukkah? The shocking aspect of the tiny little passage this is all we have in terms of an explanation for the holiday in all of rabbinic literature. So rabbinic literature is the first Jewish code of law, the Mishnah, written in 200 CE. 2 giant commentaries on the Mishnah, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. And then we have midrashic literature, which is homiletical, exegetical literature, which interprets biblical stories. The Babylonian Talmud, so the commentary to the Mishnah produced by Babylonian rabbis from the 2nd century all the way through the 6th or 7th century CE, has a little passage which explains the story of Hanukkah. And you will not find any reference to a military conflict. So again, remember, we're talking about why is a military conflict being suppressed? What is the reason for Hanukkah? Our rabbis taught. On the 25th of Kislev commence the days of Hanukkah, which are 8, on which a lamentation for the dead and fasting are forbidden, because you have to celebrate. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oil therein, and when the Hasmonean dynasty prevailed, They made search and found only one cruse of oil, which lay with the seal of the high priest, but which contained sufficient for 1 day's lighting only. Yet a miracle was wrought, and they lit the lamp that lasts for 8 days. So the miracle is not that they won. The miracle is that this little vial of oil lasted for 8 days. How did we get here? Right? The oldest and the only eyewitness account of the Hanukkah tale tells us that the Hasmoneans won. Big surprise. They establish a holiday. Done. Can't get more simpler than that. And then we have a series of documents that suggest that the Jews are theologizing this account in a way that makes it palatable for Jews in Babylonia, in Egypt, and wherever else they would have lived in the ancient world. Now I want to suggest, and anything we do after this is kind of bonus. There are some sources afterwards, but like I said, we don't have to do them if we don't have time. What I want to suggest is that there is an intentional repressing of the military conflict. First of all, as I've been saying, to make it palatable for diasporan Jews, to make it relate to them, right? This is not just a war that's relevant to those who lived through it, but it's a story of divine intercession, teaching us that God hasn't abandoned us. And that's a message that any diasporan Jew can relate to, but it's more than that. Rebelling against the Romans was really the most catastrophic act of rebellion ever up until that time in Jewish history. It leads to such devastation. And we're not just talking about one rebellion in 66 to 73. We're talking about earlier Jewish resistance against Roman occupation, Josephus talks about in the early first century. We're talking about the War of Quietus between 115 and 118 CE, with the Emperor Trajan quelling Jewish rebellion. 132 to 135, you might know, the very, very catastrophic War of Bar Kokhba. Simeon Bar Kokhba says, I'm the Messiah, I'm the king, down with Rome, follow me. And tens of thousands of Jews follow him to fight against Hadrian, and it's the biggest disaster in Jewish history, even worse than 70 CE. About 250,000 Jews are massacred. The rabbis have had enough. Enough with the fantasy, enough with the messianic dreams, enough with the rebellion. The close association between these wars and this idea that the Messiah is on the other side of the war. Enough, the rabbis say. There's a famous rabbi named Akiva who, the Talmud says, said to his friend Yochanan ben Torta, maybe Bar Kokhba is the Messiah. And his friend Yochanan ben Torta says, Akiva, weeds will grow out of your cheeks before the Messiah comes, which is the ancient rabbinic way of saying pigs will fly before the Messiah comes. So there's an active effort to not glorify military rebellion and to say the Messiah will come when God brings the Messiah. You cannot galvanize it in war. You cannot hasten it with pain and death and suffering. And the rabbis say, we are going to celebrate this holiday because it's a holiday that reminds us of divine intercession. It is a holiday that reminds us of the everlasting covenant between God and the people, that the people should always survive and have this temple, and if not the temple, then have, after 70 CE, have synagogues. But the point is that God has a concern for the welfare and the survival of the people. Now, going into the early medieval period, you see a resurfacing in very interesting ways, a resurfacing of the military conflict and of the Jewish memory of that military conflict. So in the liturgy of Hanukkah, Hanukkah, as you know, is for 8 days. And there's a special little prayer that's added to the daily liturgy that you only say for those 8 days. Jews only say for those 8 days. And this liturgy, which was written maybe in the 9th century, maybe a little later, does have reference to the military conflict. In the days of Mattathias, the wicked kingdom of Greece stood against your nation Israel. They forced them to abandon your Torah. You in your great mercy stood in their defense at the time of their troubles. You fought their battles. You judged their judgment. You avenged their avengement. You placed the strong in the hand of the weak. So some have said to me, but Malka, the rabbis did not suppress the military conflict. Our liturgy is all about the military conflict. And I say, yes, except it's missing one thing. It's missing the Hasmoneans. Who saves the people in the liturgy? God, right? If you look at 1 Maccabees, Judah, his brothers, his father, his followers. In the liturgy, you fought their battle, you judged their judgment, you avenged, you placed the strong into the hands of the weak, right? So yes, victories will come, but only when God decides, only when God protects us. It's not at the hands of humankind that we survive, it's only by God's good grace. Finally, I want to bring you to a midrashic early medieval text that has a very, very fascinating retelling of the Babylonian Talmud tradition. So the Babylonian Talmud tradition says, what's the reason for Hanukkah? So we have something similar over here. This midrash, Pesik Rabati, says, why do we light candles on Hanukkah? And we have this tiny little line. When the sons of the Hasmoneans, the high priest, defeated the Hellenists, they entered the temple and found their 8 spears. They stuck candles on them and lit them. And so here I think you have a very interesting fusion of this military image of spears, that they're using weapons. And yet you also have this image of them using the weapons to make a menorah. So I'm going to stop there. I included some sources on early Christian retellings of the Hanukkah story for your own edification, or perhaps you might find it interesting as we have a Q&A, because there's a lot to say about the early Christian reception of this story, but that it doesn't speak to my main thesis, so I'm not going to go into it with you. The main thesis that we have a very long and complex process by which Hanukkah takes on a meaning that is relevant to all Jews. Anyway, thank you very, very much for listening. I'm going to stop share so I could see all of your faces, and I look forward to some robust conversation.
Okay, so we have a couple VIP guests, which we'll give them the floor first. But I think it's Father Ken and Father David Andrew Fisher. I don't know what your login name is. I see Father Ken. I'm going to unmute you. Oh, that's even Father Ken. Let's see.
(107).
Okay, room 107.
Room 107.
Room 107. Okay, so I'm not sure who that is, by the way.
That's Father David Fisher.
So, and then Father Ken, I think I've also...
Is Father Ken.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I've unmuted you as well. So if you have any questions, please go ahead. I also have one, but I'll wait for you if you have them ready.
Can I go?
Yes, please.
I sent this to you, Thomas, but I'll read it.
Okay, I didn't see it, so please go ahead. Oh, I see. But yeah, go ahead and ask it.
Just as there was a creative tension between the charismatic prophets and the institutional priesthood/temple in the first temple period that created dynamic in the religion of the Hebrew people, could this be the same in the second temple period between the institutional priesthood temple and the Hellenized, quote unquote, wisdom of the diaspora Jews? Is this tension being elaborated in spiritual terms in the Maccabean literary tradition?
Can I answer?
Yes, please.
That's a very sophisticated question. So first I want to make sure that I understand it. So there is a perceived tension between the priests and the prophets in the first temple period. And you're asking whether you might map that onto diasporan wisdom, sort of intellectual life in the diaspora versus the Judean priestly leadership.
Well, I noticed in your presentation that it seemed to at times bring out that, shall we say, the institutional religiosity or religious leaders are trying to, in a sense, convince or preach to the diaspora Jews why they should have the same feelings and attachments to their history into the temple and so forth as those who might still be in or who have returned to Judea. So if there was this kind of creative tension at times between the prophets and the institutional leaders in the first temple period, could this be possibly, to some degree, an expression of a certain dynamic tension where the institutional, traditional leadership of the faith is trying to, in a sense, address this wisdom, the Hellenism, like we see in the book of Wisdom, this Hellenism that is becoming a part of their religiosity, that is new and different, but could be a spiritual power that could be used in the right way, but they need to somehow be more attached to the tradition.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I'm going to answer you by starting in the 2nd century BC, and then I'm going to go back to the first temple period. I'm writing a book. The book is on Judea-diaspora relations in antiquity. And so I'm thinking about this a lot. How did Jews in the diaspora perceive themselves? How did Judeans perceive those diasporans? There is a total disconnect. We see a real sense of Judean exceptionalism in Judean literature, meaning we are the conservators of this ancient and authentic tradition, and it's our responsibility to communicate with diasporan communities and tell them how to observe their ancestral law. But diasporan literature does not convey any kind of eagerness to be guided or to be taught by those Judean leaders, but it's complicated. I don't want to create a binary between Judea and diaspora, because at the same time you have diasporan Jews who are incredibly loyal to the temple, right? We know that Josephus, and also we know from Roman sources, that diasporan Jews are sending huge amounts of money to support the Jerusalem temple. We know because in 59 CE, Cicero tries to pass an edict to the Senate. We have his speech where he tries to prohibit the export. He calls it the export, even though we're in the Roman Empire, the export of gold to Jerusalem, because that gold should be going to Rome. So there is so much money being donated. We have diasporan pilgrimages. We have excavated, archaeologists have excavated these roads, pilgrimage roads, from all 4 directions leading to Jerusalem, not wide enough for a chariot, but wide enough for people. So we know that diasporan Jews were showing loyalty to the Jerusalem temple. Now, did they agree that there was an inherent exceptionalism or an inherent superiority emanating from Judea or from Jerusalem? So that's where I think the disconnect is. I think we have Judean writings that suggest a self-understanding that they are the leaders, right? The conservators of the tradition, but we don't have such similar statements in the diaspora. Where I would want to complicate things is if you go back to the first temple period, what I don't see is a strong binary between the priests and the prophets. I mean, I know a lot of scholarship does presume that, but I try to challenge it because I think that it could be very problematic to say they're prophets versus the priests, because it goes into the stereotype that, prophets are sort of the proto-Christological conservators of this ethical tradition, but they're treated very badly. They're on the margins. The Jews don't want to hear from them. And then at the center of the priests clinging to their power. And then there's this sort of cultural decline over the Second Temple period, where by the first century, Judaism is just like a shell of itself and only has the priesthood, but doesn't have that prophetic voice. So, to that, I would complicate it a little bit. Of course, you have figures like Jeremiah who really are treated horribly, but you also have court prophets who are very powerful, like Isaiah. You have prophets who are working with the kingship, or they're working with the priesthood, and they're very much in the center of things, or in the temple. So, I would say there is a dynamic that what you're pointing to, especially in the 2nd century BC, that I very much see when I read the sources. This sort of like we're not on the same page in terms of like what the role of Judea is, but I don't know that can be traced back to the prophets versus the priests in the late First Temple period. Then again, that's not my period of scholarship. That's really not my expertise. my area, what I'm thinking about, what I'm reading about all the time is the 2nd century BC to the 1st century BC. And for that, I would say I absolutely see exactly what you're talking about.
If I can say, in when it came to that era, the early prophets and the latter prophets, those prophets were sent by God to speak his word to different situations and to different personages that were falling away from the standard understanding and the standard faith that the people were to have in God. It was being corrupted. So therefore, those prophets spoke of this corruption, and they a lot of times blasted the priest who sort of told people what they wanted to hear, and at the same time, so did false prophets. All right, so it's very difficult to kind of separate that. However, during that era, these prophets, some were priests, some were just common laymen. They came from all walks of life, all different places, and they were called by God for a specific task. And those tasks varied. I think that would be a fair way of understanding it too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Rich, why don't you go ahead?
Ray, who do I need to?
Am I able to speak?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Thomas. Dr. Simkovich, thank you very much for the presentation. And I was curious, when we talk about diaspora, the Jews in the diaspora of the Greco-Roman world, how far could we stretch that diaspora? Because I believe there were Jews in India and they were also in Ethiopia. And silly question, but did the Jews in Ethiopia, and even maybe the Ethiopian Orthodox Christians, did they celebrate Hanukkah?
We just don't have enough evidence to know, but we know that there were Jews in North Africa. I mean, if there are Jews all over Egypt, right? So up to 1 million Jews, and Jason of Cyrene also, that's the region of North Africa. So there absolutely are Jews all over the Levant, right? And so there's no question that Jews are settling throughout the Roman world. How they celebrated Hanukkah and when did they start to is the interesting question. But the way that Josephus writes, it seems like he's taking it for granted that this is something that all Jews do. And even by that time, it's ancient. So he's writing in the 90s and he's already saying, we have these traditions about this holiday that I can't understand because it happened too long ago. I don't know why we call it lights. So we don't know, about that particular Jewish community, but we do know that Jews are all over the Roman world at this time.
So I wanted to ask a question about your presentation here, and I'm not sure if I completely understood it correctly. So you talked about this passage that you said 99.9% of Jewish people have never heard of. And if I was following you, I understood this passage was a letter that was written in Second Maccabees that was put in Second Maccabees, and it refers to this idea that the origins of Hanukkah somehow have to do with this fire or this oil fire that stays lit while they're in captivity from the time of Jeremiah to Nehemiah. And it's in the Greek version of the Maccabees, not the Hebrew version of the Maccabees, and that seems to be what the rabbis actually follow in the Jewish oral and then written tradition. Yet neither Maccabees book is canonical. And I heard in one of your other talks, and perhaps if I'm remembering correctly, even in your book, Second Temple Literature, it's possible that the evidence is such that it was a mistake to exclude Maccabees 1 because one of the criterion was Hebrew. But it's harder with Second Maccabees because it was written in Greek, yet it seems so fundamental to this holiday, even if the holiday is not as important as the other holiday. Can you talk a little bit about the exclusion of some of these books of the Jewish canon, like the Maccabees 1, the criteria used, and maybe even some of your own research on Like how certain are scholars that the rabbis or the Sanhedrin made a mistake, if they did, and what additional research would need to be found such that books like Second Maccabees, which seems to be such a key part of this Jewish oral tradition, that it would be included in the Jewish canon.
Yeah, the question of canonization is very, very interesting. I mean, I wouldn't articulate it as a mistake. I wouldn't say the rabbis made a mistake. A text this late, late 2nd century BCE that was circulating in Greek would not have been canonized. So the Greek texts, are simply not canonized. Even when Maccabees, which was written in Hebrew, was early on circulating in Greek because the diasporan Jews were speaking Greek. In fact, many of the highly educated Jews in Judea were speaking Greek. The question of whether even Hebrew was a spoken language at the time, or whether they would have primarily been speaking Aramaic in Judea, is also an open question. And so very early on, these are considered Greek texts. By the early rabbinic period, they're certainly Greek texts. So I wouldn't have an expectation that they would be included in the Hebrew Bible. The question of canonization in general is very interesting. First of all, it happened surprisingly late, right? I mean, this is 4 centuries before the rabbis decide to even make a canon. And so when they do, they already have the tradition of this is a Hellenistic work circulated among Greek-speaking Jews. So again, I don't know that it's a mistake. I think that there's a lot of really important material in non-canonical Jewish works that influence rabbinic literature, even if they're not canonical. And I'll say 1 or 2 things about what it means to have a canon in the first place. At this stage in the 2nd century BC, you're working with scrolls. You're not working with the biblos, the book. That's something that early Christians used only beginning in the 2nd, 3rd century, and then Jews adopted a little bit after that. Scrolls are fluid because you have 1 story per scroll, and you could have a scroll on your shelf, and then you could have a scroll something else next to your shelf, right? You could have a scroll of Genesis, and then a scroll of Exodus, and then you could skip to Numbers, and then you could have the book of Tobit, and then you could have the book of Judith, and you could skip Judges, and so you could add a scroll, you could remove a scroll. There isn't an urgency of having to decide what's in and what's out until you start using this very portable mode of scripture, and that's the mode of the book. So there is no urgency to decide what's sacred text and what's secular text. So I think that Jews are reading this as an authoritative, or maybe not 2 Maccabees, but I think they're reading 1 Maccabees as authoritative, as the authoritative history of the story. Whatever that means. Does it mean that it's scriptural, right? That it has this kind of sanctity that's reflective of the divine word? I would say probably not. Again, it was circulating mostly in Greek, and it's quite late. So yeah, I mean, again, the point that I'm making is that there wasn't a real binary at this early stage of what was in and what was out. That takes many centuries.
Even from the Christian perspective, a lot of these Old Testament texts that were considered deuterocanonical were introduced into the canon because of their popularity too. And they were fantastic reading that elicited some kind of a spontaneity to worship God or to become more serious about their faith. And because of that, and because of the popularity of the reading, began to be more and more accepted. Then you have the early fathers who are beginning to read these books, and they see within them a lot of Christological factors using typology. You have the typos and the antitypos, the typos that exist in the Old Testament in all of these different books being fulfilled in the antitypos, which is, in the person of Jesus Christ. And even in the quotes that Dr. Malka has shared with us, you see Christological concerns in 1 and 2 Maccabees. And also at different epochs of time, even prayers for the dead, other, say, religious practices, when they were being discussed and when they were being used, what to use and what not to use, they used these texts to be able to kind of give some kind of solidity and validity to what they were practicing at that particular time, even liturgically. So, you know, the New Testament canon, the Old Testament canon, and from the Christian perspective took, you know, several centuries to be able to put together and officially say, well, you know, this is no good, this is good, or this is proper and this is improper. In fact, in the tradition, the Christian tradition, you have many books of the Apocrypha that were not placed into the canon. However, they were very popular reading, especially among the Egyptian monks and some of the scholars of that era in Alexandria and so forth. And some of the thought, even though it is not a canonical book, some of the thought was preserved. And the easiest way is to take the Proto-Evangelium of James. It is not a part of the canon, the New Testament canon, although many of the feasts, many of the understandings and concept of who the Panagia is and the feasts that we celebrate were actually formulated there. And it wasn't necessarily that you know, they were simply, you know, rejected because they weren't a part of the official canon. Even though they weren't a part of the official canon, they had a tremendous influence on theology and even liturgical worship.
Perhaps I'm thinking of the book of Jude references, I think, Enoch or something, another one of these books that is not canonical but highly influential, at least in Christian thought. Is that an analog to the Jewish thought of the Maccabees, where it's not canonical but just highly influential, at least to their leadership or their version of a magisterium or whatever it is?
These ancient writings were considered to be very popular reading. You know, they didn't have movies and, you know, literature and so forth like we have now. I mean, this was fantastic reading, and it caused a lot of discussion and was used to formulate some Christian thought. And especially with 1 and 2 Maccabees, the light and the you know, the symbolism of Jesus being the light, and so you have fathers that are being able to ascribe to these different historical events or liturgical events in Christological ways.
Father Anthony, did you want to say something?
No, just a wonderful presentation, and I really appreciated it very much, and glad to be participating in this.
Awesome.
Thank you.
It was excellent, excellent. Thank
Malka.
you so much. Oh.
My pleasure.
Dr. Malka.
Someone say my name.
Are we going to do it again? Are we going to do it again? Continue? This is awesome.
Every day, every day. I love talking about this stuff. It's my favorite thing.
I had a question for you.
Can you hear me? I don't have a picture, but can you hear? This is,
Yeah, we can hear you, Father George.
Father George. I want to ask Dr. Malka, are you aware of the works of Professor Yuval from Hebrew University that talked at Gregorian University in Rome? He figures, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I know his name. I know his name. Go ahead.
You know his thesis?
No.
That Hanukkah was used because of the birth of Jesus. They had to have a feast in order to, you know, to, if you go to YouTube and go to, I have him frozen on the screen here.
Let me see. What's his?
His name is Professor Israel J. Yuval, Y-U-V-A-L. And he gave two lectures. He had 2 lectures at Gregorian University in Rome on Nostra Aetate, our document from Vatican Council II. And basically he says the Jews adapted their celebration of Passover because of what Jesus did. And he ends his one presentation, if there wasn't a Paul, you wouldn't have a Rabbi Akiva. That's when they started to write down the oral traditions in the Mishnah and also the Talmud, because that was supposed to be kept oral. And then he talks about Hanukkah in his second presentation, that basically, because we were celebrating the birth of Jesus at the time when the sun was born, they needed something to counteract that. And
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I would be curious to know what he does with all those early sources that are pre-first century. I mean, maybe what he's saying is that the reason why it endured and was refashioned in the way that it was by the rabbis was a response to early Christianity.
Yeah, they adapted it. They adapted the story in the sense to, because like you said, it wasn't really a celebration of Hanukkah, but with the idea of Sukkoth.
Right.
And so I just find that intriguing. As you were making your presentation, I was wondering what he would say about your presentation. Excellent. I do have your notes here, and it's heavy. You know, you do a great job.
Excellent.
And by your last name, are you Jewish or are you Slavic or?
My married name is Simkovich. I'm Jewish. I'm modern Orthodox Jewish. Okay. My maiden name is Zeiger, which is actually German.
Because sounds like it's Croatian and I'm Croatian.
My husband it's Czechoslovakian.
Okay, that's another group.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Fisher had a question.
Yes, my question, which I sent to you, Dr. Malka, Josephus dies around 100, and Akiva ben Joseph around 135.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a shift between the historical theology of Josephus and the beginning of rabbinical Judaism with Akiva ben Joseph? And would this shift influence the theology of the Festival of the Lights?
Well, this is a very complicated question. So first of all, are you talking about the theology of late first century Judean life versus second century Judean life when the rabbis leave Jerusalem and they go up north to the Galilee? Or are you talking about these two individuals, Akiva and Josephus? I mean, what's interesting is that we're seeing a trend in scholarship to stop viewing the late first century as such a turning point. There's actually a great book edited by Daniel Schwartz called "Was 70 CE Really a Watershed in Jewish History?" Because it has been viewed as this moment where everything changes, and Josephus might represent the old view, and Akiva is this forward-thinking. How do we survive without the Temple and Jerusalem Jew? But now scholars are starting to shy away and look more for continuity between figures like Josephus and Akiva. I mean, I really don't know how you would compare them in the sense that Josephus is not working within the rabbinical mindset, although he does tell us that he's from a priestly family. So, I think that in terms of the theology of the Festival of Lights, Josephus is like any American cultural Jew who's celebrating something but not sure why. Like if you ask, your average American Jew, yeah, I light the Hanukkah candles. I can't tell you the story word for word, but I know that I do it. I'm committed to doing it. And Akiva probably would have been much more familiar with the problematics of the story as somebody who was resisting and trying to convince the Jews around him to not rebel. He would have been very sensitive to the problematic aspects of how the holiday was commemorated in a way that Josephus might not have been sensitive to. So there's a lot behind that question. And all I would say is I think there is more continuity between the first and second century than many scholars have assumed.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Excellent presentation. Thank you, Doctor.
Well, I'm always happy to talk.
So I still have another question, if that's okay. Yeah. So, I don't know if there is an answer. I don't know if this is scholarly or just theological. So tell me if this is not a relevant question. But I stumped a Dominican priest with this. So Ellen can know this. So I was reading my Ecclesiastes, the Solomon's book, where he writes all about the woes of life and everything like this. And in one place he writes that, and he uses poetic language. It's something about in all his life he's only found one good man out of 1,000, and basically no good women. And my understanding is that. And again, maybe this is theological, not scholarly, so I'm not sure, but he's referring to his father when he talks about the one good man, because King David is a man after God's own heart. King David is the one who climbs the hill of Jerusalem where Abraham had sacrificed his son earlier. He has this imagination and sacrifice to preserve God's place, which maybe perhaps later God preserves his temple in a similar way, or it appears that. And though King David has this one sin, according to Chronicles, I think they list him one sin, which is his major sin. A Catholic would say the mortal sin was with Bathsheba. And Bathsheba is obviously very, very smart. She sits at the right hand of Solomon. She does the machinations to make sure the other guys get killed or pushed out of the way so Solomon gets the throne when David is about to die or dies. And probably she's whispering in Solomon's ear when he's making all these amazing, wise judgments. She's probably young too, because she sits with him his life. So, but I think Solomon realizes his mother is not good. So she's brilliant, but she's not good because she's involved in King David's one major sin. That somehow he repents and he's still a good man because God somehow is forgiving. And so Solomon, with the wisest man ever, can't picture what a good woman looks like because the only good woman in any man's life is his mother. So does Maccabees answer?
This is a popular guy.
Does Maccabees answer this?
I bet.
I tell my mother that every day.
Well, my mother's on this call. That's why I said that. Yeah. So.
Academics don't view this text as having been written by Solomon, although, the Hebrews is Kohelet. Sorry?
The Ecclesiastes, you're saying, yeah.
Right. So the Hebrew is Kohelet ben David, Kohelet the son or the descendant of David. Rabbinic tradition does identify him as Solomon, and I know that in some manuscripts he's identified as Solomon. But in academic reading, and here I'm sort of caught between my traditional reading and the academic reading, but the academic reading would be that a lot of this material is actually Hellenistic, and especially this a wisdom text like this that is so antagonistic towards women has a place within this broader Hellenistic rubric. In fact, if you read Sirach, you'll find very similar attitudes towards women. Not progressive, as we might say, but certainly well situated in a Hellenistic mindset. But, like I said, the rabbis read this text, attributing it to Solomon. I think that's a brilliant read, and one I never thought of before.
So the Dominican also had never heard this, and they know everything. So
just ask them.
Yeah, right. I just ask them.
Great.
Well, does anyone else have any other questions, Rich, or anyone else?
The only thing I observed, it's not so much a question, is that we talk about in the Christian churches, the longer canon and the shorter canon. And I was always fascinated by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Ethiopia, who has many influences from the Jewish faith. And they even have a longer canon that includes Enoch and I believe Jubilees and some others. So, but I think, talking to some of our members, I think in the future we would like maybe to hear a talk on First Enoch.
That is the reason why I laugh, not to be rude. It is the hardest book.
Oh.
The compositional layers are so complicated, and it was circulated in so many different languages. I mean, there are scholars who work on only this their whole lives. It's a fascinating work, and actually it's one of the few works also, like you mentioned, the rabbis cite as authoritative even though it's not canonical.
Authoritative but not canonical. That's a very interesting distinction. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'd be glad to come back. I really liked getting to know you. I'm going to put my email in the chat box if you ever have a question. I'm always very, very happy to engage and try to answer if I can. Or if you have anything to tell me, any insights, I'd love to hear them. It was really nice.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you
Doctor.
so much. Thank you.
Bless you. Thank you.
All right. Well, have a great night, everybody.
Stay safe. Blessings to you.
Safe.
Shalom.
Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas.
Well, we
Thank
still
you,
have a few people here. Do we want to end the meeting with a prayer? Ask one of our clergy to do that?
Oh,
I could say a prayer for you. In
thank
the name
you.
of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Christ, our God, we give thanks to you for your blessings you have bestowed upon us. O Holy Master, by the grace of your Holy Spirit, we ask you to guide us in all things to a deeper knowledge of the truth and a more intimate relationship with you, the forgiveness of our sins, and for all that is good for our salvation.